Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for tonight's discussion of the fantastic Oscar-nominated documentary Collective from Romania. Should have won, but it didn't. So joining us at tonight's panel is Mona Nicoara, a journalist and filmmaker from Romania who lives in New York. She was a consultant on the film. Tina Sussman, who's the senior editor at Time magazine, and New Mexico's own Sarah Solovich, who is the executive editor of Searchlight New Mexico, fantastic investigative journalism source here in New Mexico. So I wanted to start off the discussion, Mona, to ask you, why is it that this fabulous investigative journalism team is housed at a daily sports newspaper? This is puzzling to the American audience.
I think it's puzzling. Hi, thank you for having me actually here to begin with. I think it's puzzling to Romanian audiences as well, except that we got sort of used to it. This particular newspaper was part of a larger trust that was owned by an oddly corrupt businessman, like particularly corrupt businessman, who eventually went to prison. But because this was, and most of his holdings over time, most of his media holdings were like highly ideological. He owns TV channel that is sort of similar, but not quite like Fox News in the States, a little even more tabloidy. And it's a very bizarre fact that he had a sports gazette. He had this magazine, sports magazine, that was inside his trust, but had a little bit more freedom just by virtue of being a sports magazine. Everybody reads sports magazines in Romania. We're a soccer obsessed country. You go on a train, on an airplane, everybody will read this like particular sports magazine that started doing investigative journalism relating to soccer scandals, they brought down one minister of sports and youth, I think they're odd names for these ministries at one point. And then they continued to do this investigative journalism that eventually brought one of the most powerful politicians in Romania for a boxing fixing and fundraiser gala and campaign contribution violation down. And they sort of continued, and they had this kind of strange immunity inside this particular trust because they were a sports magazine. All the other magazines are much more inside this particular trust were much more sort of directional and much more ideological, much more affiliated with each with a particular political party. The entire Romanian political landscape is organized in a manner in which like each major party, we have several, not two like here, each major party has its own sort of media conglomerates that it controls. And eventually, when this particular corrupt businessman was brought down and ended up in jail, the magazine was brought up by Ringier, the Swiss media trust that has a bunch of other holdings in Romania, and has a little bit more independence just by virtue of being owned from outside the country.
So it's kind of like sports is sort of a neutral terrain, which permits sort of some of this investigation to go on. So how did the film seemed like the filmmakers were there at the very beginning of the investigation? So how did that come about that they just seemed to be there at the very get-go? Was they decided to make a film at the Sports Gazette, or how did that come about?
I think they decided shortly after the Collective fire happened. Alex, at the time, we had been working together for I mean, at this point it's about 10 years. So I guess at that point it had been like 5 years or something, told me that he wants to do a film about that one of the videographers for this band that was playing that night actually had the footage, and they wanted to collaborate doing something about this major incident in Romania, this major tragedy that nobody could like actually wrap their heads around. And it was clear that something was amiss, because about 26 people died on the night of the fire, but then another 37 died, you know, in the weeks and months afterwards in Romanian hospitals.
Yeah.
And at one point, I think Alex contacted Tolontan and said, I'm interested in looking into what you're looking, because Tolontan clearly had already made himself a name for himself as an investigative journalist, and was working on this. And Alex was sniffing around the story and decided to sniff around with Tolontan. So they had footage of the incident itself, and then they started to have footage of the investigation as Tolontan was doing it. It seems sort of crazy. For many years, he kept going around saying he's, you know, doing a film on Collective, which had happened in the past, but he was like, no, it's going to be cinema verite. It's happening before your eyes. And, you know, a lot of people couldn't understand how that was possible. And it turned out that he was focusing on this investigation that took a while to come to fruition.
Thank you. I have a question from the audience, and which I forgot to. Please, the audience, feel free to send questions in the Q&A. So Paul Barnes is asking, how did the director gain access to film the new young health minister?
Romania is not a small country, but Bucharest is a small village. So by virtue of being around the story and being around those press conferences all the time, and knowing some of the people, there are people who are associated with that minister, and some of them show up in the film, who were themselves health journalists from before, and who, you know, we kind of all know each other. And the fact that you had a young minister that just came in that was quite idealistic meant that, you know, allowing the press to see the inner workings of the ministry was part and parcel, or he saw that as part and parcel of his mission. So it wasn't particularly difficult, as I understand, not as difficult definitely as it would be in, you know, other government agencies around the world, because of these relationships that we all have in Bucharest between journalists. And Vladimir Voiculescu, remember, he was a technocrat. He was not a politician. He did not come in at all as a politician. He came in as a young, idealistic, Western-educated man who wanted to do something, and he didn't quite know what that was. And part of that's something that he wanted to do was to actually have transparency in his workings.
Right. So one of the things that I found sort of thrilling about the film was to see investigative journalism actually have this very powerful effect, which Tina, as someone who's worked for, you know, so many years in so many different journalism organizations, national, regional, international, all over the world, do you think investigative journalism is kind of on the upswing or on the downswing? I mean, what's your view on investigative journalism these days?
I think it's definitely on the upswing. I think all you have to do is look at the number of organizations that we've seen springing up in the last decade, from small ones that focus on cities and states. I mean, here in New York City, we've got one called The City, which is maybe 3-4 years old. It's focusing solely on digging around for, you know, city investigative stuff. On the national level, international, we've got ProPublica. State level, you've got Searchlight. And I think that the rise of these kinds of organizations, the Marshall Project, that's another one I wanted to mention. That's another just critical one looking at the criminal justice system. I think they show that, number one, journalists love to dig. And as more and more so-called traditional news organizations have, due to budget cuts, kind of shaved away their investigative teams, others are stepping in, not through nonprofit methods, to, you know, fill this gap, and they're really making a huge difference. And journalists love digging. So I know when I speak to journalism classes or aspiring journalists, which I do quite frequently, the desire to play a part in digging up dirt, you know, in being their generation's Watergate reporters is there more than ever. And I certainly think that, at least in this country, in the last few years with the last administration, and certainly now with the response and the aftermath of COVID-19, I just think the desire to do good investigative journalism is only going to get more intense. At least I hope that's the case.
Right. And Sarah, here in New Mexico, you Searchlight had a sort of scoop recently about the use of the Signal app by the child welfare agents. Can you tell the audience a little bit about that? Because that's kind of another sort of wonderful example of investigative journalism doing what it's supposed to do, which is holding truth to power.
Right. We got a tip from someone that the Child Protective Services, or CYFD, has begun using Signal to encrypt all documents that and communication messaging of every kind on a daily basis. At the end of the day, they essentially shred or put fire to all documentation, which is totally against the law.
I was going to say, is that legal? But it's not, is it?
Certainly not legal. And we believe that, in fact, we understand that that it is not just one department in the state government. But it's not completely unknown. For instance, Albuquerque Public Schools, which has essentially ignored all requests for public records for the last 3 years, was recently found in violation of violating state law by denying public records requests to a television station here in New Mexico and the Albuquerque Journal. And the judge just a week ago found that the APS, or the public school system, has to pay for more than $400,000 to those two entities for its violation. So this is ongoing.
Well, I mean, I'm encouraged to hear that, I have to say, because, you know, coming out of this era of fake news and how I feel like the news industry has really come under an onslaught that's kind of horrible, and that the whole fake news has been taken up by authoritarian regimes kind of all over, because it's a very useful way to sort of push the media away. So it's very encouraging to hear about some successful investigative journalism still happening. Mona, if you could tell us, I know that the end of the film, it seems a little depressing because there's a change in regime. And so you think that sort of that's the last we're seeing of this new health minister, but I gather that things have changed since then. Can you sort of bring us up to date about that?
Yes, they have changed, and then they have changed again. Vlad Voiculescu came back to the ministry in the aftermath of elections in Romania this fall. And he was brought back to the ministry at a time where, like, Romania was going through a second wave. Was it second or third? The second wave of COVID. uh, immediately sort of ran into issues with the general failings of the system, of the health system, which is in very, very poor shape for a variety of reasons, some of which have to do with corruption, others that have to do with like brain drain, others that have to do with like generally a culture in Romania of poor health care and poor understanding of the relationship to hospitals and healthcare professionals. And eventually, I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago, he was removed from the ministry by the new prime minister and from the Ministry of Health in the aftermath of a variety of, mishaps, things that he was held responsible for, things that he possibly was responsible for in terms of mismanaging this monster of a system. And also there were allegations that he was actually trying to render transparent all public acquisitions having to do with healthcare. The allocation of public money and EU money in the healthcare system, and apparently there was a lot of pushback against that, because that would reveal sort of the scale of corruption in Romania. And I think that sort of there's no clarity to any of, to what actually happened to Vlad Voiculescu at this point. It was his second tenure at the ministry, but there was a second tenure at the ministry, and has now been replaced by somebody else in the middle of a raging pandemic. Actually, the numbers in Romania still don't look good insofar as we have numbers. Again, they're apparently, it's not clear how things are counted. There's not enough testing. So whatever you get, if you have only for-profit or paid for tests, you're not going to get an actual picture of the pandemic there. So it's a mess. It continues to be a mess. This is an ongoing problem. And early on, Alex, when we were talking about the film and how to structure the film, there's a moment where you don't actually, that there's a story there, and that you're following a story, but you don't know exactly how to structure that story, right? Every journalist has that, and filmmakers probably even more so, and documentary filmmakers more than anybody else. So they end up in the edit room going like, okay, let's put this thing together, right? And there was a moment that was very, very long, and I think it's sort of, in some ways, it still continues, where Alex was talking about the system as being the main character in the film. This is not so much about Tolontan. It's not about definitely this health minister. It's about showing how the system works and where the dysfunctions in the system is, and how much corruption is built into the system itself. So
it's
that's
not unique to Romania, might I add.
Oh, it's not. No, absolutely. It's just like each country, each place has its own specifics. The specifics of the US are mind-boggling as well, the US healthcare system. It's just that Romania has its own particular flavor, and it's a flavor that has to do a lot with corruption, with covering up, and also with the need for transparency in government action in the face of any kind of tragedy. I think this is one of the reasons why it rang so many bells here in the States when it came out, because it came right at the moment where there's a friction between the official discourse and the facts on the ground. That was very reminiscent of what happened with Collective.
Right. And so, Sarah, Searchlight, I think you said, has been around for just 3 years. Is that right? Yeah. Was there a particular sort of incident that made you decide you just had to start this, or it was something that had been building and you just, what was the genesis of getting it off the ground?
I think there were a few things. One was this just pit in the stomach of a lot of people, trying to reckon with why child well-being in this state is just at the very bottom of the heap for every state in, in New Mexico, that we compete regularly with Mississippi. And, a couple of the founders just thought this has to stop. And the way to do it is journalistically, and to make it just be the story so revelatory and expose what's really happening on a statewide basis, that people would have to kind of sit up and demand change. So every time we write a story, even though it's not always about child well-being anymore, we always ask ourselves, is this story going to have impact? Why do it? Is there something that's more systemic than just what's occurring, the story on the surface, that it has to go deep and at least have the potential for change? You can't promise that. But the other reason that that Searchlight really began was because people saw that newspapers around the state were really shrinking. Both the number of newspapers and the investigative arms at a lot of those papers. And so the idea behind Searchlight was we would kind of stand in as a third arm to all these other newspapers, do statewide stories that, we really had the time to dig in, spend months on a piece, really, invest time and resources on it, and then give the stories away for free to every newspaper and news organization in New Mexico, and occasionally beyond now. But everything is intended to kind of raise, at least attention to what's happening.
So, I mean, I think, pushback is obviously always an issue for journalists. I think this goes to Paul's question about the access to the health minister. I was surprised continually while watching Collective that there wasn't more pushback, that the journalists were able to get all the kind of access they were getting to in the hospital system, to the ministries. It was just sort of astonishing to me, because people they knew what it was about, right? They knew what it was about, the Collective disaster. So I'm just astonished that there wasn't more pushback, or was there more than we realize?
I think, I don't know all the details, but my understanding is that the pushback doesn't comes only as a result of knowledge, right? You know that somebody's digging in a direction that you don't want them to dig. However, a lot of the corruption happens sort of behind the scenes and is covert. And a lot of the people involved up to a certain level don't even know that this is happening. So it becomes all of a sudden possible to access up to a certain level, at which point you hit a wall. Like, there's no terrible direct pushback necessarily, but there's a wall after which you need to investigate in different ways. And you can see Tolontan sort of like going from various angles, and eventually, the day is saved by whistleblowers, pretty much both within the health system, but also within the information system, right? So it's not so much pushback as pure stonewalling, and also ignorance. You can dig as much as you want in the direction if the actual corruption is covered and not known to the entire system, right? It looks like you have access, right? It creates the illusion of transparency. It creates the illusion of knowledge. And you just have to have the right nose to know that you need to dig deeper, because otherwise a wall just looks like a wall. It doesn't look like stonewalling, right? It doesn't look like something that you need to dig behind unless you know better in some way, or unless you have the instinct to do it. And Tolontan clearly is somebody who has made it his mission to actually access that gut instinct at all times and put it to use.
So that was another question I have here. Is Tolontan still going after the health ministry during COVID? I mean, is this sort of an ongoing, Tolontan and his team, are they sort of digging into what's going on and how COVID is being handled there?
I think they are. I mean, they're continuing to do investigative journalism, and I don't know, however, whether it's specific to COVID or to other things, but I haven't seen him actually waver from that mission. I haven't been watching him that closely actually in the last 4 or 5 months, honestly, because I've been following more of what happened was a film itself, right? But I have not heard of them actually sort of moving away from that like central mission. But what has happened is that Tolontan within this Swiss Trust, Media Trust, moved to actually run, and this is another oddity of the Romanian system, something that used to be a tabloid, actually a newspaper that was first very well respected right in the aftermath of the revolution. Then it became more and more tabloided to the point where they had like, you know, a naked girl on page 5 every day, and that was the attraction of the newspaper, and which has actually still has like a little bit of that tabloid sort of appeal and sheen, but it is also doing very serious investigative journalists at the same time. And it's this sort of like combination of market and independent journalism, market forces allowing independent journalism to continue in some way. That is, to me, it's very bizarre after having lived for like 25 years in the States, but it works. It works.
So Tina, you've worked for you know, organizations ranging from Newsday to the Los Angeles Times to BuzzFeed, now with Time. Do you find like working for something that has like national recognition like Time, does that open more doors for you? Does that make people more wary because of the national spotlight? Did you find sort of like work, because when you worked at BuzzFeed, it was still relatively new, and did that give you an advantage of kind of digging in because people didn't quite know who you were? You have such a great perspective having worked at kind of everything everywhere. I just sort of wonder what your take is on that.
I wouldn't say it necessarily opens more doors working at Time. It opens different doors, maybe working at Time. You know, in this era, I hesitate to say that any organization is more trusted than any other organization. I think that across the board, there is a general wariness of dealing with the media. And I noticed that in a striking way when I came back to the United States after many years overseas as a foreign correspondent. I think one of the things that I think contributed to that is the fact that there seems to just be this eruption of everybody having handlers nowadays. There's so many PR, and I mean, it's just astonishing. It used to be, before I went overseas, when I was working for the Associated Press, you know, if you wanted to interview somebody, it didn't matter who you wanted to interview, apart from obviously a high-ranking politician, you generally just picked up the phone or sent an email if you had email and asked to talk to the person. When I came back from overseas, I was stunned at how difficult it was to do that anymore. You know, you could try getting a quote from somebody, I don't know, working at your local animal shelter. And you have to go through so many hoops. And I just think that I don't know where it started because I was out of the country for so long, but somewhere along the way, there did develop this, I guess, fear of being misquoted, fear of being portrayed in a light that they don't like. Maybe somebody had to do something with all those people filling journalism schools as the newspaper industry was going downhill, so they went into PR. I really don't know. I actually think the more I talk to my reporters, the team I manage, when they come to me with concerns that they're having trouble getting somebody to talk to them, honestly, the more I think about it, the more I think having a huge reputation like Time Magazine does, both domestically and internationally, can make it harder, because people realize if they are quoted in Time, if their photograph is in Time, everybody's going to know. It's going to be really hard to, Time is the kind of thing your grandmother and your doctor and your friends might see. BuzzFeed News, on the other hand, I think more people might have viewed it as more of a niche operation, even though by that time it really wasn't. I mean, by the time I joined BuzzFeed News in 2016, it was 6 years on, and it had developed a reputation for breaking big stories and doing good investigative work. But there was still, I can remember being in the newsroom many times and listening to reporters having to explain over the phone what BuzzFeed News was, and even having to spell it out because people just had never heard of it. But I really do think that the whole gatekeeper mentality has just, it astonishes me how difficult it is and how long it takes to get anybody to quote, to talk to you. I think both Sarah and Mona, when they were describing the process of doing investigative reporting, I think their descriptions really point up something that an awful lot of people who are not in journalism never could understand: the amount of time it takes to do this kind of work. It is astonishing how long it can take to get, one or two people, even in a relatively benign story, to talk to you freely. Imagine what it's like trying to get somebody to talk to you about the investigation that Searchlight just did on the use of Signal. I mean, look how long it took for the reporting that lifted the lid on that erupted around the Me Too movement. It took over a year. And there were many reporters chasing down the stories of Harvey Weinstein. So time is money. And that kind of circles right back to the reason that so many news organizations have cut their investigative departments, because you have investigative reporters who tend to be very experienced, hence paid a little bit more, and it can take them months and months to finish up a single piece. So it's, but it is, that's why I think it's just so amazing when I look around and see all these news organizations that are doing this kind of work, because I know there were a lot of people who were concerned 10 years ago, it's going to go away, nobody's going to do it.
Yeah, true. And also when you mentioned gatekeepers, it made me think of, the incredibly important role of editors and gatekeepers in the news space. And that's kind of the plus and minus of the whole internet, is that when you work for a reputable organization, there are fact checkers, there are editors, or people vetting what you're doing, but it's also possible for people to just kind of post whatever they want to post without it having to go through those kind of hoops, which I think has contributed, unfortunately, to the mistrust, because there is a lot of there is in fact misinformation and false information floating around out there, along with the really responsible journalism. So Sarah, here in New Mexico, I would think it would be pretty difficult for you to be able to do some good investigative journalism in the oil and gas sector, because of the amount of money that is in that sector in this state.
That's certainly a challenge. Yeah, we're working on something right now, a kind of a follow the money story to see, where all that is actually going. When you look at at studies, what they say over and over again is that people, though they talk about fake news, nevertheless, when they know the journalists who are covering them and they meet them, they actually believe in the integrity of the news that's being reported about them, because they see how much time reporters are investing in their work. and they're, they know them as people. And so that's one reason I think that, maybe some of the best investigative journalism ever is being done right now, because there are people out there in the field, like Tina just, talked about, I mean, ProPublica and the Marshall Project, and, just, the best newspapers, they all have, like really dedicated, committed teams of investigative reporters. When it comes to oil and gas, there is just so much money, and it is being, it's entangled in ways that it's very hard to untangle and see where the money is coming and going to, and just there are deals being made, especially here in New Mexico, that completely rely on oil and gas. And it's not just financial deals, but if you look and see, what the governor is attempting to do with social services and improving early childhood education and public schooling and the whole foster care system, just right across the board, it is really all being financed on the back of oil and gas. And this state cannot afford to give up its enormous dependence on this industry, and that includes fracking. And it is at the same time, she and the legislature are attempting to bring in an energy transition plan that on the face of it would allow like call for climate, changes that would allow for climate, account for climate change. But it's really, it just seems like it's almost an impossibility to do. You can't do both, because New Mexico really doesn't have an industry, even with this new, movie industry that's moving in to Albuquerque, for instance, with Netflix and other organizations. I mean, our entire future lies and past, and present and future, it's all tied up in oil and gas.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, Sarah, if, because New Mexico is a relatively small in terms of population, and Santa Fe even smaller. So this, it's sort of when Mona was talking about how Bucharest is kind of a village, do you find that kind of Searchlight is becoming sort of well-known for the kind of digging that it's doing? And I would assume that you're becoming well-known for being at the helm of it. So is that working against you or for you, do you think? That you're having, your reputation is just kind of growing and growing here?
That's a funny question.
In a good way, in my opinion, but there may be people who, who don't want to take a call from you.
I wish it was growing more. We are better known outside the state, especially among journalists, than we are within New Mexico. And so, yeah, and I'll call journalists or organizations in New York or any place in the country, and they'll immediately say, "Oh, love what you're doing." And then I'll meet somebody right here in Santa Fe who will say, "Never heard of Searchlight." So it is, we've been around 3 years, and that is absolutely one of the challenges. I mean, it's like a marketing challenge. We talk about marketing and gatekeepers in these other organizations. Excuse me. But that is certainly a problem here. And I think it's probably because of our model, which is to give our stories for free to all these other news organizations. And so people will read our stories, which almost always appear on the front page, but they don't know it's Searchlight. It might say Searchlight in very small letters under the byline, but when we publish, say, in Rolling Stone or The Guardian, I'm able to negotiate so that it's mentioned very prominently.
So is that the deal here that you have with all the local news organizations, is that they don't credit you? Is that that's the deal?
It's something that we've had challenges, just making sure that it's caught like just part of the model, that that we're always acknowledged. Yeah.
That's amazing. I have another question here. This is Paul Barnes. Thank you, Paul, for asking us all these questions. Can Mona tell us about that amazing woman who was a collective victim who was photographed in those striking pictures? She was amazing indeed.
Yeah, she's one of the victims. Alex, I haven't spent a lot of time with each of these participants because I was focused at various points, was like, looking at the structure of the film as a whole. But she is somebody that Alex spent a lot of time with, and he spent a lot of time with the families of the victims generally. She's one of those people who actually managed to turn it from, a victim supplicant position into an artistic form of protest to turn her own story. And that's sort of quite empowering and interesting. But unfortunately, a lot of the stories of the victims didn't quite work into the structure of the film. This is, one of the things that happens with us people who work in documentary and in the edit room. You need to sort of follow a story and make sure that, Alex made sure that the victims were always kept in mind. At the same time, the story of the investigation and people trying to do something about it was not the story of the victims themselves. It was the story of the system and how the system failed those victims. So I'm a little bit less familiar with her story because of that, but she's around. I've seen her actually at events in Bucharest, and she's one of the people, together with Mihai Grecea, the videographer of the band, who was there during the fire, and he himself ended up with burns and shows up at one point in the film. There's a few people there that actually managed to lead in different ways this victim, the movement of the victims of the collective fire.
So Tina, as an editor, I know you say that you love seeing all these kind of keen young journalists who are really keen to dig. Do you find in any way that the internet has led to kind of sloppier investigative work? Because sometimes it can be kind of a way for people to find shortcuts journalistically, or is that not the case? This is just a thought of mine. I don't know whether it has any basis in anything. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I think you raise a good point that I hear frequently, and I totally disagree with it. First of all, they're not all young, the ones that want to dig. Some of the best reporters I've met, well, they range in all ages. So I always, whether you're at BuzzFeed or Time, believe me, big range in age. I don't think the platform has anything to do with how good or not good a journalist's work is. You can see sloppy reporting that was done long before places like BuzzFeed and Vox and Vice came to be. It all has to do with the amount of editorial leadership that's going on in a newsroom, and that is where it becomes really difficult when you're in a newsroom that's suffered massive layoffs and that doesn't have the number of editors and the amount of oversight that's needed. I mean, when we do a story at Time, and when we used to do stories at BuzzFeed News, when I was the national editor there, the amount of oversight on each story was, and is certainly at Time, extraordinary. It can take, and I'm not talking about a big, deep investigative story either. I mean, I've been editing a profile of somebody for the last 2 weeks, And before I started editing it, another editor had been working on it. You know, we have the fact checking process. We have, if it's a sensitive story, we have our lawyer look over it and say, you know, and point out things that might be red flags. We have the copy editors who have to look it over. We have a senior editor and then another editor who kind of backs up the senior editor after the senior editor's done to look over it. It's a real privilege in a newsroom nowadays. You don't have a lot of newsrooms that have that kind of oversight. Whether you're at a newspaper, an old traditional newspaper like, say, the Los Angeles Times, where I spent several years, or whether you're at a place, you know, like a smaller newspaper. I mean, the amount of editing that I witnessed at BuzzFeed News was more intense than the amount of editing that I ever went through when I was at the Los Angeles Times, based in Baghdad, covering the war there. You know, that was a big frickin' story. And it didn't matter what you wrote, you were going to have people complaining about it because there was nobody was in agreement on that war. And so, yeah, when I went to BuzzFeed News, I was like, wow, this is really impressive. The amount of intensity that goes into making sure that the stories are rock solid. So I don't think that the age of the internet has affected the dedication of journalists. I don't think it's had any impact on sloppiness. I think the big difference, frankly, is that when mistakes are made now, they're so easily spotted to so many more people than they ever were before. And it's so much easier. I mean, you make a stupid mistake, and we've all done it, and suddenly it's up on Twitter. And then next thing you know, somebody's yelling fake news. You know, of course you can't trust those stupid journalists. Well, it used to be that if I made a stupid mistake when I was working for the Associated Press, you know, the only people that would see it would be a couple of editors who would call the AP desk and say, hey, there's a mistake, and they'd fix it like that. So there is this, I think, idea that, oh, it's the internet, so it's full of stupid journalists that are making dumb mistakes. That's not the case. It really isn't. And I don't see any evidence that reporters have gotten lazier or tried to, you know, do things that they might not have done in the past.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Sarah, would you say you have a similar take on things?
Absolutely. You know, our stories go through so many drafts. I think it's kind of shocking to newcomers and freelancers. If there's any question about, you know, like a fact or even, you know, like a description or the structure of a story, we frequently hold stories rather than publish, you know, in order to, you know, to answer those questions. And honestly, I don't even know a single journalist, and I've been in this business for 35 years. I don't know anybody who sleeps the night before a story. I mean, people are just terrified, you know, and like racking their brain, like, what did I miss? Did I get anything wrong? Is you know, just to the most, you know, minor details, because we know, especially, and that is the problem of the internet, in the age of the internet, any little mistake is seized upon. And you know, we're held to such, you know, standards that it can be quite terrifying.
Yeah, that's a good point. And of course,
before I publish a story, I still get nervous. I mean, I've been doing this for years, and yet my finger sits there on the button, and I'm like, okay, am I ready to publish? I'm ready to publish. It's like, it never stops.
Yeah, it's one of the most stressful jobs in the world.
It really is.
Like, what did I get wrong? You know, and you just, and inevitably, if you do get something wrong, it's something it never even occurred to you to question. It's, you know, just something that was, I don't know, it just slips through, and you can't even account for it, or you didn't account for it during, you know, your reporting. But we have just an entire fact-checking procedure in which we now give to every reporter, color coding everything, like, exactly what questions have to be asked. A company is named, and so is it Inc. or is it LLC? I mean, it's just done on a very precise basis.
The other thing that strikes me that's changed a lot in journalism, certainly during all of your careers, was that, once upon a time you were working on a story, you wrote a story, and that was it. Now you write the story, and you have to do Twitter, and you have to do Facebook, and it's like you have to do so many versions, different versions of the same story. It's like you have quadruple the work that you used to, right? I mean, it seems.
I think that's, yeah, I would say so. I mean, I know that when I moved from being a reporter, I left reporting in 2019, end of 2019, when I was at the LA Times. And then I became a full-time editor. And I always loved reporting, but I do remember, thinking to myself, do I really want to do this for another 10 years? Like rush outside of a courtroom into 20-degree weather with a teeny tiny little phone and try to quickly, file a story for the web, and then go home and sit down and have to sit down and write that same story in a totally different approach for the print edition of the LA Times. And I think it's no surprise that, you see, I mean, I'm on a lot of Facebook groups, and I certainly look on Twitter. I see announcements all the time from journalists far younger than I am saying, I'm burned out, I'm fried, I can't do it anymore, I'm leaving. And I don't know what the solution is to that, to be perfectly honest. I mean, a lot of news organizations, obviously they have desks whose sole job is to do the Twitter stuff, is to tweet, put things on Facebook, do TikTok, Instagram, you name it. Thank goodness. I mean, we have that at BuzzFeed, we have it at Time. But even those people are struggling to catch up, because there's always a new program for you to, mastering, so you can promote the staff stories better.
Well, it's like there's a whole new profession, which is a bit of a tangent, but there's something called a medical scribe. When you go to a doctor, with these are sort of the bigger hospitals that have the budget for this, but because doctors want to be able to look at the patient while they talk at them, so medical scribe is there in the room taking the notes and entering everything into the computer. It's like it's a whole new profession. Which is just, computers are supposed to be time savers, but no, now it's created a whole new, this is a tangent, so forgive me. So is there anything any of you sort of want to raise that we haven't discussed yet here? We're getting close to our end point.
One thing I actually wanted to mention, and this is something because both Mona and Sarah kind of touched on it, was the idea of readers, our audience, what have you, viewing journalists as people, real people. And I think that makes a big difference in terms of investigative reporting. I think there's just such an idea among so many people who consume the news and who write frequently very nasty notes to reporters or editors, that those aren't real people. There's some hideous machine cranking out a story they didn't like. And the one thing I used to do as a reporter, and I tell my reporters now to do this, is frequently if I would get really unpleasant email, I would respond in a relatively nice way. I would never argue. I'm not going to get in an argument with somebody, but if they were pointing out something that they thought was wrong, I would write back and actually explain something, why we did put it that way. And then I'd always sign off, thank you for reading BuzzFeed, or thank you for reading the LA Times. And I can't tell you how many times I got responses from people saying, my gosh, I'm so shocked. I never expected a response, and thank you. And I'm really sorry for being rude. So I think that it's something I always encourage journalists to do. And I feel like in some small way, that's that's a way to help alleviate this assumption that journalists are just all out there practicing fake news on people.
That's an interesting tip that you pass on to your students. Yeah. Mona, any last thoughts, or Sarah?
Well, it sort of occurs to me that we're actually in a position of privilege, and we all got problems, but some people have more problems than we do, and we come from like very different systems that are adjacent to systems that do not exist, where it's not possible to actually do journalism or investigative journalism. And they're next door. Romania is next door to Hungary, where press freedom is has been massively under attack for more than 10 years now. It's right next door to Russia, where you put, journalists go to jail. So
Go to jail, they get
we're
shot.
kind of lucky to be even asking ourselves all of these questions, and to be able to complain about our problems and to be able to look into the future. That's a luxury. The future is always a luxury, and we keep forgetting that. That's all I had to say.
That's a great point. Sarah, any parting thoughts?
Journalists are complainers. I've never been in a newsroom that wasn't filled with complainers. However, I think that most of us, especially those who've kind of stayed in this business a really long time, is that we are really lucky. I think, that most of us do this because we love it, not because we're getting rich doing it. We get to ask questions, and for the most part, people answer us, and people tell us their stories and share their lives with us, and it is an extraordinary privilege. So despite all the complaining, I don't want to do anything else.
Well, that's great. I cannot thank you all enough for this fantastic discussion and for joining us. And Mona, kudos again to the entire collective team. That is such a wonderful, powerful film. I'm really glad that it got an Oscar nomination, that it got some really well-deserved recognition. And so Tina and Mona and Sarah, thank you all very, very much on behalf of CCA. And thank you, audience, for tuning in.
Thank you
Night,
so
everybody.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.